In the first decade of the 20th century, then President Teddy Roosevelt published his letter, A Letter to Boys on Manhood. In this letter, he appeals to young boys around the country to make sure that they're doing their due diligence to becoming the best men they can be for the future of their country. He appeals to religion, family, and physicality in defining the ideal man. Over the course of his presidency, Teddy Roosevelt, the cowboy soldier, defines a new and ideal masculinity for the United States, and perhaps a very necessary one as our country was undergoing a masculinity crisis. In an era where you saw the closing of the Great Frontier, mass immigration from Europe as that was increasing, and of course first wave feminism, which sought to destroy long-held notions concerning gender and sex, one had to ask themselves, what was the status of the American man, and what was the future of masculinity? Over 1 century later, as we see millions of young boys take to the manosphere content of Andrew Tate, Sneeko, and Fresh and Fit to define themselves as not just men, but alpha men, of course all in response to the blowback of fourth wave feminism and the woke left, we have to ask ourselves that question again. Are we as a nation currently experiencing another crisis of masculinity? Well, let's talk about it. For the purposes of this video, I will basically be historicizing the manosphere. I want to look at the masculinity crisis and how that affects the way that we are basically experiencing a lot of what's going on today. But of course, for purposes of this channel, I'm going to also historicize it by really looking into what was going on in Gilded Age America right around the turn of the century, what caused that, and how we're experiencing that exact same thing today. One thing that's always going to be true about history is that it basically works in circles and nothing is new under the sun. I did want to touch on the fact that the masculinity crisis is not something that they referred to it specifically during the Gilded Age. So the masculinity crisis was coined mainly during the 1960s to refer to that era around the turn of the century where you were, I guess, experiencing the actual masculinity crisis. The fear of the American man, the future of masculinity, and what that meant overall for just notions around manhood in this country. And there are really 3 big causes that I was able to discover for that masculinity crisis. One of the major ones being the closing of the Great Frontier. And that is something that happened in 1890. So basically throughout the 19th century, you have the notion of westward expansion. You have kind of like manifest destiny. And in the mid-19th century in particular, you have this huge movement towards westward expansion. One of the last examples of that would be the land run here in Oklahoma, where you have the settling of Oklahoma even before Oklahoma is admitted into the Union as a state. You have all of these men. It's what we associate with the cowboy basically going out into the West, claiming unclaimed land that the United States has left for settlement, typically for white settlements. And from there, they're able to establish homesteads, their families, just, homes, but also businesses as well. There's a lot of entrepreneurship that is associated overall with the frontier itself. And that is something that becomes really scary in 1890 when you close that frontier, because what you have is that the United States moves from a space where men are basically establishing their own businesses, they're establishing homesteads, they're entrepreneurial, but you move to market capitalism. That, of course, is where you have the rise in the middle class man, a man who works in many ways as we do today, a 9-to-5 job. He's not a business owner, but he does have a boss. There's the corporate leadership and the corporate ladder that he has to climb. A lot of these fears around masculinity absolutely surround the middle class man, in particular in the United States, and there are many reasons for that. But the middle class man comes to be that example of a man who has lost an aspect of his masculinity. And the closing of the Great Frontier, which in many ways was a way for men to establish that entrepreneurship in them, is a very, very vital part of that crisis of masculinity, where now you kind of have to get a job, you're gonna have a boss, you're not gonna be doing your own thing anymore. And that is definitely major in this in the story. Another major factor in the crisis of masculinity as experienced in the United States in the late 19th century is one of the things that will always be controversial in this nation: immigration. You have mass immigration happen in this country around the turn of the century. In fact, between 1870 and 1900, 12 million immigrants come to the United States and begin to call this country home. Of course, these immigrants, they're oftentimes arriving with their own families, and they are bringing, for obvious reasons, their own cultures with them. In a nation where you have these heightened fears around many things concerning, of course, masculinity and the family, it becomes a bit of a conspiracy where a lot of immigrants and the fear that immigrants are bringing this culture are going to threaten the ideals of American culture, the more Protestant background. You have a lot of Italian immigrants in particular, 4 million of them that come around this time, and they begin to represent about 10% of America's foreign-born population. And a lot of those Italian immigrants are actually Catholic. They're not Protestant. You also have the mass arrival of a lot of Eastern Orthodox Jewish immigrants, which also is a problem, up to and including the arrival of Chinese laborers, which happens mostly westward. But in 1882, Congress actually passes the Chinese Exclusion Act, which excludes Chinese laborers from coming to the United States for about a decade. There's definitely a lot of racism tied to why the Chinese specifically were excluded, but it does come out of that fear in a lot of ways. In the book, Gay New York by George Chauncey, which I'm going to actually refer to because there are parts of the book that I'm going to be definitely using it, you know, as far as this video essay is concerned. He does mention that there was just a fear in the United States because a lot of the immigrants were coming from stock that was not considered ideal. They weren't people coming from a lot of Western European nations like Germany or France or the UK or more Nordic countries. They were coming from places like Hungary, Russia, you know, a lot of Eastern European countries and Southern European countries, which a lot of Americans looked down on as not being part of the ideal stock for what makes an American an American. Of course, with the Chinese Exclusion Act, you also have, as I mentioned, the more racist epitaph of these people aren't even white, they're not even European. You even have that notion with a lot of African Americans who are already living in the North, because you have at this exact same time, at least coming into the earlier parts of the 1900s, the Great Migration begins to happen. So it is something that you kind of see across the board, but it still definitely feeds into the fear of masculinity, specifically with middle-class men, and that is for a reason. A lot of men, specifically Italian men, are arriving here single. They're not coming with their families like a lot of Jewish immigrants are, for instance. And a lot of those Italian men and a lot of these European immigrants are poor and they're working class. And being working class, even though there's certainly that exclusion and the superiority that a middle class man might feel over a working class man, a middle class man, once again, is into the trade of market capitalism. The Great Frontier was already closed. They're not like their father or grandfather who may have been more entrepreneurial. They're working under a boss and they're trying to climb the corporate ladder, versus, let's say, an Italian immigrant who is working a poor manual labor intensive job. So here, even though you do have the superiority of middle class over more poor and working class backgrounds, you definitely see where masculinity plays into it, because despite the fact that they are poor and working class, a lot of these immigrants from China, a lot of these immigrants from Europe are working very physically demanding manual labor intensive jobs where they have to get down and dirty. And that is in and of itself masculine to a lot of these middle class men. So even though they may look down on them, the labor that they do in their occupations still speak to their masculinity. And that is a very, very major part of why a lot of middle class men, once again, feel as if their masculinity is being threatened. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, of course, we have first wave feminism. And first wave feminism is something that hits the ground running in the late 19th century. A lot of the earliest first wave feminism was actually tied in many ways to the abolitionist movements to end slavery in the mid 19th century. But then, of course, once you get into the later 19th century, what you really have is the movement for suffrage. That is the right for women to vote. Women are starting to be admitted more in medical schools and higher education. In 1915, the American Medical Association actually begins to admit women. And then, of course, probably easily the biggest feat of the first wave feminism is, of course, the 19th Amendment, where women get the right to vote. That is in 1920. And first wave feminism arises as probably, in many ways, the biggest of these evils. And the only reason I'm saying that is because with women being admitted into higher education, with women having the right to vote, what is one thing that is really being threatened that had happened, you know, that was the norm several generations or just a generation earlier? And that, of course, was the separate spheres. During the Victorian era, during the 19th century, you have the idea of the separate spheres in the West, where men, we do our own thing. Women, they do their own thing. They're very, very separate. Women who are out working are typically considered sex workers in a lot of ways. There's just that notion around women having, their own thing, their own spaces, and men having their own things in their own spaces. So as you have women entering the workforce more, you have women going to higher education or pursuing, up until the completion of their, grade school and things like that. And then, of course, finally, the right for women to vote. What you're essentially seeing is that women are becoming more autonomous. Women are making more decisions in the home. Women have a bit of extra income as they're working. Women are making strides, and that is a major part of what is threatening the masculinity of middle-class men, or just men in general across this country. First wave feminism, I said, just really arises as that really, really big evil. I feel like feminism is one of those words that triggers people honestly just instantly all the time. Like I feel like even somebody calling themselves a feminist is always triggering, but first wave feminism is definitely a very effective wave of feminism, and it's something during the Gilded Age and right around the turn of the century where we're definitely seeing first wave feminism become arguably the most major player in the crisis of masculinity that you experience at that time. Oh Lord, I feel like my hair is looking a little crazy. I don't know. Anyway, there is another angle to the crisis of masculinity that I wanted to touch on, and that was actually the more queer angle. I think it's something that I wasn't really able to get a lot of information on just through my research, but it was definitely something I was able to get a lot of information on thanks to Gay New York. Shout out to George Chauncey for that book. And really just the growing visibility in the late 19th century when it came to queerness and the fairy. So during the Gilded Age, a fairy referred to a very feminine man who with the three-piece suit and top hat just could not pass for masculine. And in 1892, the Washington Herald actually ran an article titled, "Here Mr. Nickel is a place to prosecute." And in this Washington Herald article, the writer is basically shedding light on fairy resorts and drag halls, which are becoming really, really popular in the late 19th century. Some of them are like Wallala Hall, you have Manila Hall, you have the Black Rabbit, you have Little Bucks, the Palm Club. These are all some of the halls that George Chauncey actually named specifically in 1899, but Paris's Hall is probably the most famous of all of the fairy resorts at that time. In the late 19th century, you have the Committee of Five start to basically look into, after the publishing of this article, they're looking into these fairy resorts, the Boweries, and they're trying to see exactly what's going on behind the scenes with all these fairies. And there's a very, very funny quote that I wanted to read that actually a member of the Committee of Five in 1899, after going to the Columbia Paris's Hall, was writing this. This is what he referred to as the degenerate hall. "These men act effeminately. Most of them are painted and powdered. They are called Princess This and Lady So-and-so and the Duchess of Marlborough, and get up and sing as women, call each other sisters, and take people out for immoral purposes." This is a very interesting quote that I wanted to share, mainly because of the fact that I think in a lot of ways we're almost sort of seeing this again today. One of the biggest quotes of the manosphere is like, embrace masculinity, reject modernity, or whatever it is that they say. And I think we really, really see that in some of the Committee of Five. And, these are really just called anti-vice societies that became popular in New York in the late 19th century. A lot of them originally were more so going after like sex workers, but with the publishing of that Washington Herald article, they start looking more towards Paris's Hall, other fairy resorts and things like that. And the idea or the growing prominence of the fairy becomes really major. Even in this time, you have the rise of the Hamilton Lodge Ball, which is a very, very popular drag drag ball in New York that brought tens of thousands of people to New York every year. They were really prominent. Ethel Waters actually hosted one of those balls, and these were balls that were officiated by police. So police were not going to these balls in the 1920s and 30s to like disrupt it as we would expect. They were officiating these balls, and these drag queens could have their pictures published in newspapers, and they won prizes and things like that. So that's about how mainstream these things were getting. And the growing presence of the fairy at this time speaks also to that crisis of masculinity. It's that fear, again, that we as a nation were clearly not appealing enough to masculinity, and we're producing these very, very feminine, sort of degenerate fairies who are moving around calling themselves princess so-and-so, as the investigator says, and they're wearing makeup and they're dressing as women, and they completely lack masculinity because it says something about our nation. What happened to masculine men, and what can we do to fix that? But these are definitely some of the major things I wanted to shed light on when it comes to that masculinity crisis: mass immigration, the closing of the Great Frontier, first wave feminism, and the growing visibility of the fairy in the late 19th century. It is really funny because I always say that late 19th century New York is like a place that I would love to go. Like, I just want to experience it. Late 19th, early 20th century New York, I just want to experience it for a week because it sounds like just a mess, but in like the best and worst way possible. But you really have to think about New York at that time, and you know how prominent or how big and how quickly the city was growing. And the fears around masculinity are centered mainly around men who live in urban areas, men who live in Boston, New York, Chicago, you know, not necessarily men in small town country, like small country towns. So in a lot of ways, when you look at just the culture around the late 19th and early 20th century New York, that Gilded era, there are just so many fears that are becoming for specifically middle-class men. I do focus mostly on middle-class men because I think that's where the crisis of masculinity typically shows up. However, this is something that is being experienced by men in the United States across the board. It's just that middle-class men tend to be the face of it. But yeah, this is just, it's really how we get here, and that is how we get to the crisis of masculinity as experienced by men in the late 19th and early 20th century. So what was being done about that, and what would men do to try to hold on or at least bolster the masculinity that they felt their society should be representing? It's very interesting, but there are a lot of ways, and a lot of those parallels tie very directly with the manosphere as we're seeing and experiencing it today. So let's go ahead and get into those. So there it is. We are in a masculinity crisis, and what exactly is being done about it? Well, a lot. I did start this story earlier with Teddy Roosevelt for a reason, because Teddy Roosevelt, he's often associated with the aesthetic of the, well, cowboy soldier. And it's very interesting actually that Teddy Roosevelt arises with that image, because Teddy is somebody who, I guess he has his own childhood trauma. I was able to read into how his father referred to him as a punk and kind of weak, kind of, you know, when he was growing up. But the cowboy soldier is a very interesting one, because you think about it, Teddy Roosevelt is president between 1901 and 1909. The Great Frontier was closed as far back as 1890. So in that era, you don't really have this, the idea of the cowboy is something that's mainly in the mid 19th century, but he being a cowboy soldier, and of course his participation in the Spanish-American Civil War, bolsters up that image of Teddy being this man who is on the lam. You know, Teddy Roosevelt was a man who would go to Africa and game hunts. He had like ranches in North Dakota. He just loved hunting. Everything he did was about bolstering up that masculinity in an era where, like I stated, the United States was going through a masculinity crisis. But I did want to definitely mention the fact that his aesthetic as a cowboy soldier in an era where cowboys really aren't the thing anymore is most definitely hearkening back to the Great Frontier closure, when you still had that entrepreneurial spirit where men were going out into the West and establishing themselves in homesteads and families and all those sort of things. That isn't really happening anymore in the early 20th century. So his popularity as a president makes a lot of sense in that era, and a lot of men, millions of men, of course, are most definitely, they feel like Teddy feels. And his letter to appeal to manhood for a lot of young boys in this country is a lot of the fears that Teddy himself had about the future of men and masculinity in the United States of America. So over the course of researching for this video, I was actually able to look into the red pill. And I don't know why I'd never done that before. Obviously, I'm not like the target audience for the red pill, but I was able to see that the red pill is almost entirely associated with physical fitness. I don't know why I associated it more with like, I guess, more incel rhetoric, even though it most definitely has those ties. But the red pill is basically the call for specifically men and young boys to go and just work on their physical fitness. You know, it's about going to the gym. It's to make sure that you look the best that you can look at all times. It's most definitely about fixing and I think bolstering the outside to also fix the inside. So a lot of what you are going through, just having that gym routine, going to the gym, getting fit, you know, whatever goal that you have, it also helps to create discipline, for instance. So that really is where the red pill comes from. And I saw this YouTube comment, I don't know what it was, but I don't know where it was, but it was somebody who was basically like, it's weird how like a strive for physical fitness somehow ended up in this huge moment for like incelism and like this weird hatred for women and a lot of the other things that we associate the red pill with today. But the red pill is actually associated mainly with physical fitness and like gym culture, and a lot of red pill content creators or manosphere content creators like Fresh and Fit, Andrew Tate, of course, he has like his workout routine that I was able to see on YouTube. They all focus a lot on physical fitness, which is very interesting because we see that exact same thing over a century ago when we have our Gilded Age crisis of masculinity. Okay, so with that in mind, are we surprised at all that during the Gilded Age, you have the growing popularity and probably the very first time in American history where bodybuilding becomes a very, very major part of American culture? Well, that is what happens. In the late 19th century, you have Bernard McFadden, who is one of the earliest examples of a bodybuilder. And he actually establishes a magazine called Physical Culture Magazine, which really, really jumps in popularity around the turn of the century. Circulation is 5,000 in 1899, and it is 100,000 in 1901 and 500,000 in 1919. So the very first large-scale bodybuilding competition is held in 1903, and I got the winner as like Al Trabar. I didn't look too much into his story, but at this specific time, Bernard McFadden and the popularity and the way that he really pushes for physical fitness, it actually makes a lot of sense that you have it happening right when you have this crisis of masculinity. Masculinity is once again being associated with that physical fitness and the ability to be a very rugged but also very built man who's focusing on building his muscles and lifting weights, gym culture. I'm going to get into that a little later as well, and all the things that we associate with, honestly, the red pill today. So it's very interesting that it's happening over a century ago as well. Physical Culture Magazine actually does post like nude photos of like men and bodybuilders. So I was in Gay New York, George Chauncey actually mentions that there was the popularity of Physical Culture Magazine, you know, with the girls, but at the exact same time, Bernard McFadden actually denounces queerness and homosexuality. So he's definitely appealing specifically to straight men, and he's actually saying that actually no, these images aren't gay, you know, they're just here to show the ideal male body. This is what ideal masculinity looks like. So the growing popularity and the way that the Physical Culture Magazine just jumps in readership, I have the tendency to say viewership, but these are all magazines, that just jumps in readership, most definitely speak to the more physical aspects of masculinity. In his letter to Boys on Manhood, Teddy Roosevelt he actually mentions physicality specifically there as well, the ability to be physically strong as a man. So the growing popularity of the Physical Culture Magazine is 100% an example of that, and almost ties completely with the way that we see the red pill develop as a way for men and boys to develop themselves physically while also developing themselves mentally, and of course, you know, their masculinity, where your physicality becomes a direct representation of how masculine of a man you are. Following up on the topic of physical culture and physical fitness, this is when we also see the rise of the YMCA. So the YMCA was established in the mid-19th century, but it really gains popularity. It blows up in popularity more around the turn of the 20th century in the Gilded Age. And a lot of that has to do with both physical culture, gym culture, but also kind of harkens back to the separate spheres. So you have the YMCA, which of course is male exclusive. And with that, you're basically seeing where a lot of men are once again pushing for that exclusion and that separation from women. If women are joining the workforce more, if women can now vote and women are in spaces that are historically been male, you have these men who are definitely pushing to establish those spaces where they can just be with other men. Something that is, I guess, for them becoming less and less possible. I mentioned earlier about a lot of Italian immigrants and immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe who are poorer and working class. It's also worth noting that a lot of those physical jobs, manual labor jobs they had were worked, again, exclusively by men. So even though the whole era of the separate spheres was kind of coming and crashing down, you still had this maintaining of these jobs, these occupations where only men were doing them. When you look at the building of the railroads in the West with Chinese immigrants, but of course a lot of the manual labor jobs that are being taken and undergone by Southern European men, specifically Italian men in this time, these are spaces where men can just be men. And like I said, a lot of Italian men are arriving here as single men. They're not coming with families, so they can maintain that exclusion. With the YMCA and the growth of gym culture, you're seeing middle class men basically strive for that exact same thing. They're reading Physical Culture magazine, they're going to the Y, they're making sure that they're building themselves physically, but they can do that in the company of other men. It is a way for them to, once again, not necessarily like blatantly exclude women, but definitely a way for them to not only delight in the company of other men, but also build themselves up physically. So the popularity of the YMCA at this time definitely speaks to that. Again, it is another thing where you see the exclusion of mostly more working class men, because being with the Y, it comes at a cost. But you do see that middle class men are striving for that autonomy. They're striving to build that masculinity and that camaraderie with other men. And the popularity of the YMCA at that time most definitely speaks to that. All right. And lastly, well, what do you have? Another major thing, and we mentioned that earlier, was the founding of the Boy Scouts of America. So the Boy Scouts of America was founded in 1910 by a man named James E. West. He'd actually been to England, and he basically came to the United States to establish an American version of the Boy Scouts of America to appeal more to like American idealism. It is a major thing for Roosevelt, of course. In fact, his letter to boys and men is published in the very first edition of the Boy Scouts pamphlet in like 1911. So with that in mind, the Boy Scouts of America are exactly part of that appeal that Roosevelt, that I started out with earlier, where he's appealing to young boys to make sure they can become the best men that they can be. And the Boy Scouts of America, I wasn't even aware that by autumn of 1910, you have 2,500 leadership applications from 44 states and about 150,000 youth inquiries. So the Boy Scouts of America becomes major really fast. And a lot of the activities appeal to, one, they're very military style. It's very militant in its approach, that a lot of the young boys, they're out. There's definitely like a military regime, and I want to say discipline to the way that they're taught to behave. They're outside a lot, building tents, campfires, hunting, fishing, all of those things that are associated with masculinity. And once again, it's a way to get boys out of the house and in the company of other boys and older men, of course. So you have your lodgers. They're just participating. It's just a way for, I believe in, when you think about it, middle class men, because of course I'm not aware that these are necessarily free, and I know that a lot of working class people probably wouldn't even have had their children there. It's a way for middle class men to not only establish aspects of their masculinity, but also look out for the masculinity of their sons. You're putting your son and his siblings, they're going to the Boy Scouts of America, they're going to be outside. There's a military, you know, there's that military aspect of it. You're making sure that your son can be the best and most masculine man that he can be. And to really have the Boy Scouts of America grow so quickly in the early 20th century most definitely speaks once again to that fear and that crisis of masculinity, where they're basically like, we're losing our masculine men, y'all. These women, they're in our space. The fairies, they're, I don't know where that's coming from. You know, they're scared and they're worried. And with the Boy Scouts of America, the ever-growing popularity of the Boy Scouts of America, that's another way for them to affirm their, not only their masculinity, but their masculinity for their young sons as well. Definitely bolstering up that Teddy Roosevelt ideal of becoming the best men that they can be for the future of their country. Okay guys, my cat Ati has decided to make a full-blown appearance. Typically she's the one that sits on this chair, but while I'm filming today, I guess she's decided to go ahead and join me. I hope she doesn't meow too much overall, but I did kind of want to I did want to follow up on yesterday's clips. Obviously this is a different day. I'm sure the outfit change gagged you, but I wanted to touch more on how the masculinity crisis, and I'm going to get into how it is in the 21st century, is tied almost entirely to feminist movements. It's almost a reaction to feminist movements. So in the late 19th century, when you have first wave feminism really hit the ground running, you have this masculinity crisis, as I stated, that really blows during the Theodore Roosevelt, so, you know, the Teddy Roosevelt administration. That, of course, which sort of hits its peak and its pinnacle with the 19th Amendment, so the suffrage movement wins the right for women to vote. And in the 1960s, you have second wave feminism really hit. That touches more on contraception, even touches things such as like spousal and marital assault. And of course, you have the Roe v. Wade decision in the early 1970s. However, you do have a men's rights movement that actually comes out in the 1970s as a response to that as well. So in a lot of ways, you do see the roots of the manosphere in that movement in the 1970s. There's scholar Debbie Jing, and she specifically ties a lot of the manosphere that we see today to the explosion of the World Wide Web in the 1990s and coming into the 21st century, which is sort of where we are today as a nation. The manosphere as it exists today and the men's rights movement and the masculinity crisis as it exists today plays out so regularly on the internet. It plays out on internet forums, places and spaces like Reddit, 4chan, I know was a very, very major push with a lot of that. So what you have today is a masculinity crisis, but it's coming for the most part from a group of men who are almost entirely chronically online. I do want to specify that because it almost feels as if sometimes when you're online, things seem to be a much bigger issue than they are, let's say, in real life, which wouldn't have, of course, been the case during the Gilded era, during the Gilded Age, because you didn't have the internet at that time. Following second wave feminism, 50 years later, we're in an era of fourth wave feminism. And that's something that I can speak directly towards in my lifetime. One of the biggest movements to come out of fourth wave feminism is #MeToo. And #MeToo, which was really a way for women to get online and talk about their experience with sexual assault. Me Too was something that it was kind of just a space for women to say, you know, this is something that occurred to me as well. You are not alone in this experience. And the blowing over of that movement, it really hit its peak with the destruction of many Hollywood heavyweights, like Harvey Weinstein in particular, is one of the people we associate with that movement. You also had people like Bill Cosby. You think of Jeffrey Epstein. You think of what's happening with Diddy just, you know, today as we're speaking. These are all these really, really powerful men who had this status in Hollywood, and they use that to oftentimes abuse and exploit people. And the Me Too movement was basically a way to say that this is something that's being experienced by millions of women all over the world, and you know, you're not alone in that experience. However, Me Too had a pretty big backlash, and I think one of the biggest ways that we can actually see the backlash of Me Too is with the Time's Up. And one of the biggest examples I have of that really is with Amber Heard and her situation where Johnny Depp was able to actually win a defamation suit against her overseas. And the Time's Up movement with Amber Heard was very much a blowback to the Me Too movement. We saw that with Olivia Wilde. We saw that with Meg Thee Stallion and Tory Lanez, and that situation where a lot of women who are coming forward about a lot of things, there's that blowback, there's that pushback. And a lot of men, there were even studies that are showing that men were less likely to want to mentor or work with women because of the fear of being accused and being viewed as a sexual predator. So in a lot of ways, when you really look at where the 2010s comes from and coming out of the Me Too movement and the way that women were so vocal about their experiences with sexual assault, especially with fourth wave feminism really peaking and also being tied, of course, to chronicle onlineness and being online, it makes a lot of sense that you have had all these movements. You have MRA, such as the men's rights movement. You have MGTOW, which is Men Go Their Own Way. You have the Red Pill. There are just a lot of different things that occur and happen that have happened just in the last 10 years that are all a response to the fourth wave feminism. And in my last video where I actually talk about wokeness, a lot of this is actually tied to that anti-woke campaign, because people associate feminism almost solely and associate feminism so strongly with the movement for woke, and how they've completely bastardized that word. So that is one thing that is definitely important when you see the rise in the masculinity crisis as it exists and we're seeing today. My cat is really cutting up. I'm sure you probably heard some scratching. I don't know what she's going through right now. Anyway, as we get to today with the masculinity crisis and the rise of individuals like Andrew Tate, Sneeko, and Fresh and Fit, there are a lot of other manosphere content creators, but those are the ones that I think a lot of us, at least those who aren't in it, kind of associate with it, because I'm not somebody who's really watching that, but I am somebody who, everybody's heard the name Andrew Tate at this point. Andrew Tate comes out of a physical fitness background. He is actually somebody who was a fighter. I know he was involved in I don't know if it's like UFC style fighting or boxing, but I do know he comes out of that background, and a lot of his interest, of course, is physical fitness. A lot of these men sort of work as masculinity coaches, I want to say. And one thing that is definitely true about masculinity, at least in the West, is that Western masculinity has historically not really been about a state of existence or simply being. It's always been about actions. So you aren't just masculine because you exist in masculinity, you're masculine because of what you do. So you have masculinity coaches where people, I guess, are, they're taught to be more masculine. That's just kind of the approach that Western culture, and you see that, of course, even with the Gilded Age, it's just always had that approach to it's always had that approach to masculinity. So with the feminist movements, with masculinity feeling attacked or insecure, it makes a lot of sense that you have so many young men today who are kind of falling into that familiar pattern where they do feel like, once again, there's that masculinity crisis. It comes through physicality. They're, of course, trying to, I'm looking at my cat as she's walking around. They're, of course, trying to build themselves physically, but at the exact same time, they are associating a lot of what they do with this, what they feel is an attack on masculinity. And I think Time's Up is a perfect example of that, where you see that a lot of them feel as if masculinity is being directly attacked and directly threatened. One of the things Andrew Tate actually appeals to is this like fear of men and fear of, things that men do. And Andrew Tate does a really good job of sort of bolstering into that fear or attack on men to appeal to a lot of his audience. Once again, my cat is in the background and she's cutting up, but it's perfectly fine. We're almost wrapped up with everything. But yeah, the masculinity crisis as it exists today comes out of that same fear. It comes out of that same backlash to feminism, as we saw in the Gilded Age with first wave feminism, as we're seeing today with fourth wave feminism. I just wanted to associate those two together, though. Wherever you see the rise of feminist movements, you are going to see a rise in the West of the masculinity crisis and the growth of a lot of young men who feel as if there is a direct attack on masculinity through women, through the LGBTQ and queerness. It's ties to immigration, as we're currently going through another immigration crisis in this country with the way that, especially now with the recent election of Donald Trump, it's all the same pattern. I think with history, you sort of learn to see the exact same rallying cries and calls, and you can kind of see, oh, it's all happening again. And we're most definitely seeing that crisis of masculinity right now. So there's a lot of reasons why we are currently facing another masculinity crisis in the United United States, but I definitely wanted to tie what was going on today specifically to the Gilded Age and how you see the crisis of masculinity around the turn of the century, around the turn of the 20th century, and how it ties almost 100% parallel with what is going on today. It's very interesting, and it's just something that I've been thinking about more recently, especially with the recent election of Donald Trump, and I feel like we should be having these conversations, but whenever, as I always say, whenever we have these conversations, it's always good to historicize them so we can remind ourselves that, hey, this isn't really new. We've seen this before. It's a pattern that we're familiar with. We can probably put guesses on exactly how it's going to play out, but definitely also, just monitor and see, this is what was done, this is what's happening, this is why it's happening, and what can we do to, really get to the bottom of, this crisis that we're experiencing. Thanks as always for your time. So Merry Christmas, and if I don't have another video before the new year, Happy New Year as well. Bye.